hearing. So we'll talk about the withheld devices and data and how that impacted our ability to provide a complete report to the Senate here today. We'll talk about the cybersecurity issues that we have found, the hardware configuration control issues, atypical anonymous logins that are present on the systems, the listening ports and attempted connections on boot up, and internet connections and internet history that was found on these devices as part of the course. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the withheld devices for a moment here. As with any audit, access to information and the right information in a timely manner is absolutely critical to finding a complete result for an investigation. In the case of this audit, we were never provided access to the routers and network-related data. And that becomes very impactful when we start talking about validating and confirming unauthorized accesses to the election management system itself and to the other devices. Let's talk about the cybersecurity issues. Now, the Department of Homeland Security has a division called CISA. And CISA has a recommendation that's published on the internet for how to configure and manage election systems that is freely available, and it's recognized as kind of the gold standard for securing an election system. I will tell you that every item up here is part of that recommendation from CISA. I will tell you that in Maricopa County, they failed to perform basic operating system patch management functions. Now let me explain that for a bit. So if you have a home computer, you realize that every Thursday or Wednesday, depending on your cycle, Microsoft will release a security patch to correct vulnerabilities that have been discovered since they released the operating system and it was installed on your computer. The last time that the operating system was patched on the Maricopa County election systems was the date that they installed the Dominion software, which was the 6th of August of 2019. Okay. So at the time of election, it had been over a year since that system had been patched. We found that that was also the same case with the antivirus definitions. So we know, as part of this world that we live in, that people are coming up with new ways to hack a system, to exploit vulnerabilities and get unauthorized access to the systems, and they're doing this continually. All major security vendors update their antivirus at least on a weekly basis to make sure that we can protect our systems from these newly originated vulnerabilities and exploits. The last time that the antivirus had been updated on the Maricopa County systems was the 6th of August 2019. Okay. Now, Maricopa County did release a statement saying that if they had patched the operating system or if they had updated the antivirus, that would have invalidated the EAC certification for the voting system itself. Obviously, there are a couple of issues with this position. And the first one is that we are relying on a certification system that would impose obsolescence instead of security in the very act of trying to secure a voting system. That is nonsensical, and it should never occur. So if that is in fact the case, we need to take a very close look at what we're relying on to validate and certify these election systems and software to ensure that we're not certifying guaranteed obsolescence of the system. Now let's assume for a moment that what Maricopa County said was true, that they could not update those systems because of this certification issue. There are a couple of problems with that, as borne out by the artifacts on the actual EMS server itself. So if that is true, then that would mean that no new executable files, no new dynamic link libraries could be created or modified on that system after the date of the software installation, which once again was 6 August 2019. What we found is that there are 4 executable files that were created after this date of Dominion install. There were 45 executable files that were modified after this date of install. There were 377 dynamic link library files which were created after the Dominion software install. And there were 1,053 DLL files that were modified after this date. So if we assume that what the county represented is true, then in fact, that voting system would not have been certified at the time of the election. Let's talk a little bit about log management here. So there is a federal statute that requires the preservation of election-related materials for 22 months after the date of the election. That applies not only to paper, but that also applies to digital artifacts. Maricopa County failed to preserve the operating system security logs to cover the dates of the election. They provided security logs early in the audit process, but they did not provide the Windows security log itself. When we examined the EMS server, we found that the dates covered by the security log only went back as far as the 5th of February 2021. Now there's a couple reasons for that, and we'll go into those later, but the bottom line is that they failed to preserve those logs, or at least those logs were not turned over to the auditors. And so I'm assuming, since they were part of the subpoena, that those should have been provided had they been present. Okay. Next item there is credential management. This is probably the most offensive item on this list to me because it carries such a huge impact on the securability of a system. What we found is that for the election management system, the adjudication systems, the ICCs, and all of the voting related systems, they all shared a common password for both user accounts and for administrative accounts. And just to be crystal clear, it was the same password for all those accounts. So to complicate matters as well, those accounts had not been changed since the installation of the software. So they were established on the 6th of August 2019 and never changed. There furthermore was not an individual accountability of the users who access specific accounts so that you could tie a username and action and an individual when you discovered something that was an anomaly. Okay. We did not see any software or any effort to establish and monitor a host baseline of programs and processes. Furthermore, we did not see any log aggregation or methodology by which to establish and monitor the network communications for this system. There simply was none of that software present on any of these devices. Next slide, please. We also saw and detected that there was a failure in hardware configuration within the voting system. Now, what you're seeing right here is the system, the acquisition photos for the system that was identified as the Adjudication 2 workstation. Okay? Now, you will see in that picture that there are 2 hard drives that came out of that system. It's not uncommon to have 2 hard drives in a system for data storage, et cetera, et cetera. However, both of those hard drives are bootable, okay? So what that means is that you can boot from a hard drive that is not part of the election configuration and have access to the election network, okay? Very important, okay? It's clearly not an approved configuration. It was the only system that we found a dual boot situation. Now, to further complicate matters a little bit, and I'm not going to make judgment as to the legality of this or whether or not this deserves further action, is that on that second bootable hard drive, there appeared to be non-Maricopa County data. So let me define that a little bit. On that hard drive, there were Dominion databases that appeared to be, one, demonstration data, but also data that may have originated from Washington State and South Carolina. And I derived that not from an in-depth investigation of the data, that was outside my scope, but from the naming conventions of the databases themselves. Okay. So, once again, validating and approving the configuration of these systems is critically important to preserving the integrity of that election system. One of the challenges that we had was actually the accountability of deleted items. We'd talked about deleted items before, but let's be crystal clear about this. From the EMS, which is the Election Management System server, on the C drive, there were 865 directories and 85,673 election-related files deleted between 10/28 and 11/05. They also included some log files. So what is difficult to determine is that I know they were deleted. What I don't have is any accountability or any ability to track from a evidence management perspective how those deleted files were treated and what happened to them if they were archived or not, okay? There are a .dvd file, and those are actually the results of the election totals off of each tabulating device. And those were part of the deleted files that were removed from the EMS. From the, so the EMS actually had 2 hard drives. Well, they had 6 hard drives configured into 2 logical drives. So the second logical drive was called the D drive, and that contained all of the election database, both historically and should have contained the information for this 2020 general election as well. You'll note that there were 9,571 directories and 1,064,746 election-related files deleted between the 1st of November 20. Of the election totals off of each tabulating device. And those were part of the deleted files that were removed from the EMS. From so the EMS actually had 2 hard drives. Well, they had 6 hard drives configured into 2 logical drives. So the second logical drive was called the D drive, and that contained all of the election database, both historically and should have contained the information for this 2020 general election as well. You'll note that there were 9,571 directories and 1,064,746 election-related files deleted between the 1st of November 20. Of those. On the HiPro 1, there were 304 directories containing 59,387 files of election data that were deleted from the HiPro Scanner 1 on 3 March 2021. Now this becomes kind of important because part of our analysis was to look at the interaction of these scanners, these systems, and how data flowed. You'll notice that that's about a month and a half before they turned that over to us. Next slide. You see a significant amount of deletion on HiPro 3 on that same date. 1,061 directories, 196,463 files containing election data deleted on that particular date, on 3 March as well. Next slide. And on HiPro 4, you see the same high volume of deletions on the 3rd of March. Now, once again, this may be part of a normal process with how they handle votes, but the timing of this becomes a bit suspect, as well as the fact that we didn't see these deletions on HiPro number 2. And once again, I don't have a chain of custody for what happened to these votes after they were deleted. It may be a plausible explanation. I simply don't know at this point. Okay, next slide. Let's talk about the failure to preserve the operating system logs. As I explained earlier, the earliest time frame that was covered by the EMS logs, security logs, was 5 February 2021. That clearly does not cover the election time period. Now, there's a very good reason why it didn't. And if you go down to that last bullet there, you'll see there were 3 distinct there's a user-defined setting that you can define how much quantity of logs are retained before they get overwritten. Okay? In this particular case, the EMS security log setting was set to 20 megabytes of data. So the Windows operating system will preserve all the security logged entries up until the point at which it reaches 20 megabytes of data. At that point, it starts following a first in, last out approach to log retention. So as you create a new entry, an older entry is deleted and overwritten inside of that log file. Now, first and foremost, we need to remember that we do have that 22-month federal mandate. So it's clear that at least what existed on the EMS when we received it as part of this audit, we did not have the time period covered by that federal mandate as it was supposed to be covered. That security log was not turned over as part of any other documents that we have by Maricopa County. So I'm going to assume at this point that it's not available for us to look at, or else they would have turned that over to us. Now, if you look at that last bullet, that first in, first out approach all of a sudden becomes readily apparent as to what happened on these distinct dates. So on each of these dates, an individual executed a script, and that script repeatedly looked for a blank password for all of the accounts on the system. Depending on the system, there were only about 16 accounts that were present on a given system. Okay? So this script was run multiple times. On 2/11, 462 log entries were overwritten by this script. On the 3rd of March, 37,686 log entries were overwritten by this same script. On the 12th, which is the day before we received the system, there were 330 log entries overwritten by that script. Now the challenge here is that I know that this occurred. I know which account did it. It was the EMS admin account. If you reflect back to what I just said about the lack of accountability of assigning that username to an individual, it now becomes extremely difficult to prove who did it, okay? Now, luckily, we happen to have some historical data from the MTech video feeds. And so we leverage that data to backtrack and align these times, and we have captured screenshots of Maricopa County people at the keyboards during those time periods. Okay? Now, we've identified those individuals, but we will not release their names because we understand what the scrutiny is and what the impacts would be to those individuals. But I just want to tell you that the very point that they did not have EMS. Okay. Now, remember the lack of log retention at this point. We could not find any logged entry that corresponded to this activity, okay, from the security logs. Those Windows security logs only went back to the 5th, but everything was purged on the context of the election to be audited. But that clearly was not the case in this instance. Context of the election to be audited. But that clearly was not the case in this instance.
So just to clarify, so this is a log file specifically from results tallying and reporting, which is the Dominion software. That entry says that someone went into the program and clicked on something that said, I want to purge all the results for this election. That goes through and that deletes all of the
we have redacted specific elements to include the host name and the IP address and some of those types of things. But the fact of the matter is that those items are recorded as part of that normal anonymous log activity. You will have the host name that logged into it. You will have the IP address that originated the request. In most cases, you'll have the username as anonymous, but that username is then validated against the access control lists and the user authentication mechanisms and validated. So the very next log entry in a normal anonymous activity is a validation of that user's credentials to access that particular device or process or whatever they were accessing. What you see on the left is something that we discovered in the logs, which is what I call atypical anonymous login. Okay? You will notice that none of those items that are captured by normal activity are present in this log. You don't have an IP address of the originating device. You don't have a host name of the originating device. And furthermore, when I look at these in context of the actual security log itself, there is no validation of a user's credentials immediately following this. There are hundreds of these types of anonymous logins in the security logs that we do have. I cannot tell you at this point if this same type or pattern of activity occurred during the election cycle, because these logs don't exist that cover the election, okay? But I can tell you that without access to that router data and the network data, I cannot validate whether or not these were legitimate accesses. You'll notice that it is a login type 3, so it was a remote access. I cannot tell if this is a legitimate access or an unauthorized access at this time. Next slide, please. So we also took a look at what happened when the EMS was booted up. And let me walk through the methodology here to kind of assuage everybody's concerns. So within the, when we actually imaged all these processes and these systems, by the way, we imaged 770 devices and we gathered over 114 terabytes of original forensics data, okay? And we preserved that in a forensics image file that I could then leverage without fear of modifying or changing anything on the original device. So we took that image file and we turned that into a virtual machine. I created a enclave that I could boot that virtual machine up into, and that I could then monitor the boot processes without connecting to the internet, without exposing any voter data to unauthorized users. And I actually booted up the EMS to see what happened, what it was listening for, and to identify if there was in fact any zero-day malware in the memory. What we did discover is that, as you would expect, there were a number of ports. This is a normal part of an operating system. Ports are used to establish connections and provide functionality to the operating system. We've discovered 59 of those that were open. And while most of these things were what I would have expected, there were some unexpected high port activity specific to the WinExe, which controls your accesses and your logons, and your DNS, which controls your domain name service. So if you go and you type in yahoo.com, the computer will use the DNS service to actually determine which IP that is so that you can connect. And then the DHCP server. All of those are normal, valid Windows processes. But for example, DNS, the default port on that is port 53, okay? In the case of the EMS, we not only had the port 53, but we also had DNS monitoring on a high port, and I won't list that port number here in this open forum, but that was a little bit unexpected. I will tell you that on the EMS that you were utilizing both IPv4 and the newer version IPv6 enabled. So these services had dual functions with dual listening ports and things of that nature. There were ports and there were services that were enabled that allowed remote access, okay? So the RDP protocol, for example, as well as the terminal services were enabled on the EMS. Okay. Next slide. As part of that memory analysis, we did a complete check of the callouts and the attempts to connect from the EMS out to the internet. Now, once again, the county has repeatedly said that these were isolated systems, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The EMS attempted to connect to those IPs, most of which are normal. I would take a look at the level 3 parent, the Edgecast connections there, and I would probably request from the Maricopa County the documentation for those functions that that rely on those connections, and to determine whether or not those are certified or not. We were not provided any of that certification document, but those are the two items up there that I would ask Maricopa County for some further clarification on. As part of this analysis, I was able to determine that there was no zero-day malware in the memory at boot up of the EMS server. Next slide. Let's talk about internet history and connections. Okay. As you will recall, Maricopa County commissioned 2 independent auditors to come in. Both of those auditors had a finding that there was no internet connection at the time that they conducted the audit. Okay. When I initially did the analysis, and I was only searching the what is called the allocated space. So the allocated space is what you as a user see when you open up Internet Explorer or when you open up File Explorer. When you see that directory structure, that's allocated space. When I looked at the internet history of the allocated space, I had the same conclusion as the auditors did. However, I took this one step further. I actually carved the unallocated space in the entire file system for internet artifacts. Okay? And when I did that, the history was significantly different than both the representation by the auditors and the representation by Maricopa County that these systems had never connected or were exposed to the internet. And we found internet activity and multiple visits on the EMS server, 3 of the EMS client workstations, 1 adjudication workstation, and then the ReWeb 1610 and the Regis 1202. Now, before I get into this, I want to kind of walk through my methodology a little bit. So it's very common for operating systems to have default URLs, compatibility caches, things of that nature that may have an internet URL as part of that artifact. So in order to ensure that we didn't get any of that default data, I only reported on internet artifacts that, one, the date occurred after the installation of the Dominion software, so after the 6th of August 2019, and that had multiple visits to the same site, okay, with dates after that time frame. So that would eliminate any of the default URL artifacts that may have been on the system. Next slide, please. Okay, so from the EMS server, you'll see that there's actually 3 visits to the same site on the same day, okay? That clearly is not a private URL or a private IP address. And so what I can tell you is that the EMS server, at least on that date, was connected to the internet, okay? Now, I'd also like to point out that relying on the unallocated space for these artifacts, I don't have a complete history of all the internet connections because things get overwritten, things get changed, things of that nature. But the importance of this is that at some point in time, specifically those last visited dates, this device was connected to the internet. Now, if you look at that date, there's also a correlation to the purging of the database. It's the day before the audit, okay?
Almost same time exactly.
Almost the same time exactly, okay? Obviously, this requires an explanation, okay? Next slide, please. When we talk about the EMS client, here are the connections. Now, the 9 connections at the top there, you'll see that as far back as February of 2020, there were 4 connections made to that URL, to the Microsoft URL. And then on the 22nd, which coincidentally enough is during the time of the audits, there were 5 connections to the Microsoft URL. I included that lower set of findings to illustrate that the importance of some of the items that were not produced to us. So not all of the election-connected devices were produced to us for analysis. And that IP of a 192.168.100.11 is one of the it's a private network that was the election network. And you will see that it accessed a bunch of web pages off of that device indicating that it was a configurator or it was a file server or something of that nature. I want to draw your attention to that very last line, the m_network_wireless_LAN.html. That was accessed on the 19th, on the 30th of October, 2019. Now, we have not received any information about any wireless LAN configurations, but yet here you have someone accessing it from the EMS client to access what I can only surmise was a wireless LAN configurator on that date. And you can see that the EMS admin 01 account was used for that. Once again, who the actual human was behind that account, I cannot tell you because of the shared passwords and the shared user accounts. But I can tell you that not all the devices were produced to us that would have shed significant light on our findings. Next slide. Okay, once again, this is EMS Client 3, and you can see that the last date, there are 6 visits to Microsoft.com, and the last visit was on the 3rd of February, 2021. Now, keep in mind that those previous 5 visits were obviously before that time frame, and we don't have a record by nature of this artifact when each of those visits occurred. Next slide. Okay, now REREB 1601 is kind of an interesting case. Now, once again, we did not receive any network configuration diagram. We did not receive any functional information as to the network. It was one of those things that as an auditor, in most cases, I can go back to the person being audited or the entity being audited and say, what is this? Okay, how did this function? How did this interact? In this particular case, in this particular situation, there was extreme resistance and, quite frankly, in my opinion, obstructionistic actions taken by the county to prevent this type of exchange. Now, this system clearly was connected to the internet. Now, whether or not that was by design or whether this is one of those isolated and protected systems that the county has indicated never touched the internet, I cannot tell you. But I can tell you that it had significant internet access, and this is only something that would fit on the screen, right? There's literally thousands of connections to the internet by this system. Based on the naming convention, I would assume that this is some form of web-based server that was used in the election system, because it was produced under the subpoena, which that was one of the requirements for. Now, the other thing that I will tell you is that this device was produced to us on an external 4 terabyte hard drive. And originally it was represented to us as this was a forensics image of this device. When we actually looked at it, we found that all of those devices that were produced on the external 4 terabyte hard drives, they were simply an operational system clone of that device, and it was not preserved in a forensics manner. What I can also not tell you is what steps were taken on the part of the county to ensure that the unused portion of that hard drive, not occupied by this device, I cannot tell you what steps were taken by them to ensure that those were wiped or zeroed out so that we would not commingle data, okay? So I do want to caveat these findings and the Regis findings with those statements. But clearly, these devices had continual and repeated access to the internet. Next slide. Okay. This is the Regis 1201, and that, by the way, is the host name, not the function of this device. And once again, you see repeated access. That IP address is actually the public IP address for the maricopa.gov public URL. Next slide. So I appreciate your diligence and your patience on this. And as we think about what I've talked about today, it really boils down to accountability, right? And making sure that our election systems are secured. I will tell you that they were not, based on any measure that I, as an IT professional, performing countless vulnerability assessments and incident responses, that I have occurred, had a client that engaged me, had this state of a network, it would have resulted in a failure on our audit. So at this point, I would like to remind people that from a totality of what these findings are, there simply is no accountability by anyone accessing these devices. You had shared passwords. You had shared user accounts. You had remote access. If someone could get access to this system, they wouldn't need a zero-day exploit. Okay. The systems were so far out of date from a security compliance standpoint that it would have taken the average kitty hacker less than 10 minutes using Metasploit to hack this system. Okay. And I would like to remind everyone that's listening to this that when you have a network of computers like you have in these voting systems, it only takes one person bringing in a little hockey puck with admin access to provide external remote access to that voting system. And in the situations where you don't have accountability, you have shared usernames and you have shared passwords, you simply cannot guarantee the security and the accountability on those systems. And I thank you very much for your time, and I'm available for questions if you have any.
Thank you.